Awesome. Thanks, Jordan. Yes, so as Jordan mentioned, this is the Teams and Office 365 external users unstructured and structured session. My name's Peter Carson. We're going to get into some intros in a second. I just want to bring up first the sponsors links on here. So the ComSource conference obviously wouldn't be possible not only without you as attendees, but also as all the generous sponsors who had originally, I guess, thought about this being an in-person event, and then COVID changed all that, and now it's an online event. Kudos to the team pulling this together. It's pretty impressive getting multiple different time zones and everything up and running. If you haven't checked it out, there's actually an expo hall. The company that I represent, Extranet User Manager, here in the sort of middle right side of the screen. We actually have a booth down in there, so if you want to go experience a little virtual reality, go check it out. It's actually a pretty cool experience from that point of view. So in terms of agenda for today, we're going to continue. I'll do a little deeper introduction on myself, and then we'll dive right into out of the box external sharing. We'll talk about Teams and provisioning and sharing, and then get into Azure Active Directory, the business-to-business features in there that allow you to share, not just from a SharePoint and Office 365 point of view, but more broadly, anything that's connected with Azure AD, and then into portals for external users. I will try and pause periodically through and just have a look at the Q&A and see if there's anything in there from a questions point of view. So feel free to post your questions in there. We'll have a little time at the end of the session as well. And there's also a breakout Teams meeting after this session. If you want to get into an actual discussion and converse back and forth, welcome to entertain that. There we go. So I mentioned Extranet User Manager is my company. I'm the president. We're based just outside of Toronto in Mississauga, Ontario. I just got my renewal notice July 1st, so I think it's number 11 for me, Office Apps and Services, Microsoft MVP. So pretty excited about that. You know, it started as a SharePoint MVP, and then it kind of evolved with the program from that point of view. My contact information, my blog site are up on the page here. I believe these recordings are going to get posted up in the ComSource site. But if you go to our Extranet User Manager site itself, and the shortcut link is down on the lower right here, there is an event page for the ComSource event. We're going to be posting the decks up in there as well, so you'll be able to get all the details from there. Okay, so I'd like to start just, level set and talk about the different styles of external sharing that you can do in Microsoft 365. And I kind of put them into two main buckets first. There's what I call collaborative versus publishing, and collaborative can be either unstructured or structured. I'm going to talk more about that concept in a minute, but it's really that you're going to be collaborating on documents. Maybe very simple. Maybe you and I are working on this presentation together, and I just want to share a link with you so that you can view or edit the PowerPoint with me and co-author. That's a great example of a collaborative external sharing scenario. But it may be more formal than that. You may have entire project sites that you're running a big project on. You've got a number of different external vendors participating in that, providing that ability for those vendors to come in, see the content that's appropriate to them, to edit where appropriate, and work through from that point of view. So it is often project focused, but it can be what we call unstructured. I've just shared a link out with you from an ad hoc point of view, or more structured. Hey, we have a formal project structure and onboarding, not just for internal people, but for external people as well. So that's on the collaborative side. On the publishing side, this is more of a one-to-many. You've got content that you want to distribute out to a broader audience. It's typically fairly structured. There may be some sort of secure website. It could be part of your public-facing website. It may have its own private URL through that. Often, common scenario we see it is self-registration, the ability for people to discover that site themselves, go through some sort of registration process. There may or may not be some approvals around that, and then be able to consume the content that we're pushing out for that. And I'm going to be giving a talk tomorrow. I'll talk more about it later in this session on a site we're working on called VRX Therapy. And it's about using virtual reality to help with pain management from a chronic pain, spinal cord injury, amputee phantom pain point of view. And it's an example where we don't know who wants to come to that site and consume that content. We're trying to make it as broadly accessible as possible. But in order to come in and fully experience it, you actually need to be signed in. So that ability to register on the site, sign in, and fully experience it is part of a publishing concept that we like to see through there. Now, it doesn't have to be just consume. There may be some feedback mechanisms in there. Maybe there's the ability to like or comment on blog articles, for example, or maybe I can upload files into there. Maybe we want to collect videos from people and curate them and make them part of the site that we're building out there. So there is that ability to provide feedback through there, as well as profile management, sort of defining who you are as a user. So those are the sort of the two styles of external sharing that we're going to be talking about today. So if we start on the left side, the collaborative, and this is where we see more of the out-of-the-box external sharing, or what we call unstructured extranets. So if you're familiar with the external sharing features, they started in SharePoint, but they've now morphed into various different parts of Microsoft 365. This ability to click on a document and say, hey, I want to send somebody a link to this document. And maybe I want it to go to anyone, to specific people with existing access. I define how that link wants to be shared out and how they're going to consume it. And I want to take a minute just to look at these options here. And the first one, and I'll talk how you can configure and lock these down, but the first one often scares a lot of people. It frightens them. Hey, I'm sending out a link that's anonymously available and anybody can access that content. That sounds like a big security hole. The reality is it actually isn't. If you think about in the traditional past how you would share documents, let's say I wanted to share this PowerPoint presentation with you and get your feedback on it before my session. In the old days, I would just open up Outlook and start a new email, put you in the to line, and paste the PowerPoint deck itself right into that email as an attachment. And I hit send and off it goes to you. It's kind of the same thing, because as soon as I hit send on that email, I've lost control of that document that I've shared with you. You can forward it on to somebody else and on to somebody else from there. So the way I like to get people thinking about this anyone link in shareable links is it's kind of like an email attachment in the sense that you can give it to somebody and they can re-forward it to somebody else, and that's okay, and it can continue going on to more people from there, and you go in eyes wide open, recognizing that, but then also recognizing that you still have control because everybody's coming back to the same document. They're not seeing all these different copies that are in different people's inboxes. And if that master copy gets updated, there's a single version of the truth. Everybody's seeing the up-to-date current one from there. You can also expire those links. They may be valid just for a certain period of time, or you may change your mind to say, hey, I want to revoke that link and I want to turn it off. If you've set a document as an email attachment, as soon as you hit send, it's out of your control. You can no longer decide what happens with it from there. With these links, you can send it to somebody and say, whoops, that was the wrong person on the list there, I want to remove it. You just revoke that link and it doesn't work for that person anymore, and life is good again from that perspective. So if people say, hey, we can't turn on that anyone link, it's way too insecure, I don't recommend it for highly confidential information, but for the appropriate use case, it actually makes a lot of sense. The people with existing access is actually the one that I like to use as a default one. It's actually the only one that you can't set as an organizational default. I'll talk more about how you can work around that particular scenario. The people in Contosa is imagining that I work for Contosa, being the made up Microsoft company, and I can share it with other people without having to change the permissions on the source document itself. So maybe they don't have access to where this presentation is, but I want to still get them in and looking at it. I can share that link with them, and it adds another level of security that opens it up for those people. Or kind of my favorite one is the specific people down at the bottom here, where I know who I want to share it with and who I'm going to collaborate with. If I've got a co-presenter for this deck, I'm going to share it with them and just them, and they're the only people that can edit that. They can't share that link with somebody else and have somebody else come in. It has to be that specific person. You can set rules around, whether it's view only or editable. Is there an expiration date on it? And there can be organizational policies that I'll show you that define that as well. So this is a really powerful dialogue. Microsoft's done a really nice job of making this interface consistent, not just in SharePoint, but if I'm in OneDrive, if I'm in the Teams client, even if I've got synced SharePoint or OneDrive files on my local file system through the OneDrive for Business Sync client, when I go into Windows Explorer, right-click on it, I get the same sharing experience here. So that consistency is nice from a user experience point of view. Now there's another one that I use, not a ton, but for the appropriate use case, I again quite like it. It makes a lot of sense. It's one they introduced last year, and it's this request files idea. Now, I kind of wish that I could do it from inside of a SharePoint site or from a Microsoft team. I actually have to do it from inside of OneDrive. So that's okay. I mean, I can set up an alert and a rule and move the file where it's supposed to be once somebody sends it to me. But the idea is that you create a folder in your OneDrive for business, and then you set up a request file from there. And it creates a link that you can share with people. It's kind of like the anyone link that I was just talking about. You can give it to anybody, they can forward it on to anybody else, and people can use that file to drop documents into that folder. But the key thing is that uploaders only see their own content. So if you send it out to a dozen different people to collect feedback from them, maybe you're running a tender process and you want to get responses to your tenders, you don't want vendor A to see vendor B, you can actually use this for that kind of as a blind Dropbox. People can drop documents into there. They only see their content, and they can all use that same single link across the board. When you put your name in as you're submitting a document, it prepends that onto the document name that gets uploaded. So you can actually track who submitted which documents from that point of view. So again, just a great way to collaborate and collect input from people. I've seen conferences use this from a speaker submission point of view, saying, hey, just use this link, drop your PowerPoint deck in, we can then publish it up in the conference site and make it available for everybody to consume from there. So how do you actually configure all that? There's a number of places that you need to do it. You have to do it at the Office 365 level, within your SharePoint tenant, and then within individual site collections. And this is the middle tier where we're within the SharePoint admin interface. Let me actually switch over to the live pages for this. So if I'm in the SharePoint admin center and I come into my policies and sharing over here, this is where I see this screen. Let me get rid of the recommend. There we go. So I can separately set the most permissive that I want to allow for the SharePoint level versus the OneDrive level. That applies on the SharePoint side across all site collections and on the OneDrive side across everybody's OneDrive. So you can dial this back and say, you know what, we don't want to use that anyone link anywhere in our organization. We'll just pull that back to say, hey, it has to be new or existing guests, or it has to be existing guests only. So, you can pull that down even to the point that you say, hey, nobody's allowed to externally share. The caveat is if you do that, it's not that people won't share stuff. There's going to go back to email attachments. They're going to get their credit card out and get a Dropbox account. They're going to do other shadow IT approaches through there. So I discourage you from just logging it right down and say we're not going to do any external sharing, because it's a fallacy to think that actually stops people from sharing. It just stops them from sharing with a corporate approved governed approach. And you really want them to do it in an approved and governed way. So I recommend choosing the appropriate level and dialing that up. This is our development tenant. I'd leave it up at the anyone level, but our actual production tenant, I leave it at this level as well, because there are scenarios where we want to do that anyone linking. And there's more things that we can turn on in there in terms of limiting by domain, deciding which users are allowed to share. This one here, actually, I'm not sure why I don't have it checked in the dev tenant here. I think should always be checked that anybody I share with specifically, they themselves have to open it. They can't forward it to somebody else and let somebody else open that link. They have to use the same account that the invitation was sent to. You can force a re-verification to confirm that they still have access, and you can define what the defaults are. What's the type of link, whether it's view or edit only, rules around when links need to expire, and what they're allowed to do from there. So there's actually a fair bit of configuration that can be done here from the overall SharePoint perspective. But then if we drill down deeper and we look at an individual site, like here I've got one of my demo sites open here. If I open up the properties on it on the right here, you'd think it would be under permissions. It's actually not. You need to come over under policies, and you'll see this link here for editing the external sharing policies. So you can lock this down however you choose to say, hey, which of these levels do I want to apply? And do I want to use the same as the organizational properties, or do I want to override those and do something differently? Like I mentioned before, I actually quite like the people with existing access option. That actually makes when you click on a link to send somebody a link to a document and they already have access to it, that's the simplest, shortest, ideal link that you want to do through there. The only problem is I can't do that organizationally. I have to do it on every site collection individually. So you kind of have to think about what permissions am I going to set up organization-wide, and then what am I going to apply on each and every site collection to determine what sharing should be allowed in there. And even though you've allowed anyone sharing across the organization, you probably don't want that to mean all of your site collections. There's probably going to be a fairly small set of site collections you want to have that wide open sharing. There's actually probably a lot that you just want to have no sharing at all, that you want to keep that turned off. If you think about your internal HR team and its underlying team site where you're keeping performance reviews and salary reviews and things like that, you don't want that ability to be shared out externally at all. So you probably want to lock those things down from that perspective. So coming back to my deck here, so we've got these two screens that we've gone through here. And really, what you need to think about is you need to make the tenant level permissions as permissive as possible, because you can never make an individual site collection more permissive than a tenant as a whole. So if there's anyone, just a single site that you want to do anyone sharing for, you have to leave the anyone on at the tenant level, and then you have to turn it off at every site except that one that you want to turn it on for. So you have to be fairly careful about how you can configure your sites. And one of our strong recommendations is to have some sort of process around requesting new teams, around requesting new sites, and ensuring that the appropriate things get set through there. So I'm going to be giving a talk tomorrow and repeating on Wednesday on teams and site provisioning that addresses this. I'm not going to go into the details of the talk right now, but I do want to talk a bit about the external sharing part of this particular feature and what we've done here. And this is actually still a work in progress. We're working with a couple of clients. Basically, the way that this open source project has evolved is various different clients have asked for features. They've funded that development under the condition that, hey, it goes into the open source pool and it becomes available to everybody from there. So we've probably had 8 or 10 different clients over the last 2-3 years fund different parts of this open source project. And the beauty is they all get to benefit from each other, and it becomes freely available to anybody else. It's up there on GitHub. All the details are there. So the way that it works is there are site templates, which are really team templates now. This started as a site provisioning. It kind of morphed into a teams provisioning. And within those site templates, we have properties that we can set. So, think about a modern team site that you get as part of requesting a team. We at Envision IT actually have our own template for that called a modern client site, where we've tweaked it a little bit. We've got certain libraries, certain folders, certain content types that we want to see in a modern team site for that. And part of what we do there is we actually light up certain choices around external sharing. So actually, let me go into the full edit view here. And we can see there's all sorts of details around this template. Does it create a modern team site? Yes. And what PNP template gets applied to that? Is it creating a team? Yes. A OneNote, a planner, no by default. But as we come down to the bottom here, we see a bunch of choices around external sharing. So what we've done as part of the solution is to say, well, let's bake those choices right into the request process. So, what's the default sharing? Well, we're going to leave it that it's not actually shared. Unless somebody specifically asks for something different, it's a private site that can't be shared externally. Do we want to show that choice, or we want to just force that decision from there? And which sharing options are they allowed to choose from there? You can actually lock this down based on division, based on the site that they're choosing, how they're allowed to share that out. What are the default links? Is it a view or edit by default? So all those things you can set up in the template, so that when somebody comes into a form here and says, hey, I'll go into the temporary demos division and I want to choose that modern client site. In addition to defining things like what title and alias and visibility, et cetera, that I want for that, down here at the bottom, we can say, okay, I can choose what's allowed from an external sharing, what the default link is, what the permissions are from there, and go ahead and create that request. And that might go through an approval process, or it might just go ahead and create it. You can define how that workflow works from there. So it's important to have some sort of process. You don't have to use our solution, but have something from a governance that defines when people request sites or teams get created, what are the rules around how those potentially can be shared out externally from there. And when the site request feature that I'm showing you here is fully baked, even things like turning on the ability to do sharing will actually define things like the prefixes here. So we've already got a division prefix that automatically gets prepended onto the title and the alias. We're going to do the same thing and put, say, an EXT or whatever you'd like to denote an externally shared site. So when people go to that site, it's immediately obvious right in the title, right in the URL, hey, this is a site that's shared with external people. Put the appropriate content in there, treat it appropriately from that point of view. Just some things to think about as you're building that out. So that session I mentioned is going to be tomorrow at 8 p.m. BST. I'm actually in Eastern time, 3 p.m. Eastern time, and then it repeats again on the Wednesday as well. So check it out if you're interested on that site. So that's on the unstructured, sort of the ad hoc style of extranets. What about the structured side? And still there's that collaborative versus publishing model in there. As we get into structured extranets, typically we're talking not about a handful of people or even a few dozen people. We're talking about hundreds, thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of external people coming in. We have clients with 25, 30, we've got one with 250,000 external users in there. I mean, you can't do that style of, hey, I'm just going to put some email addresses in and share a link for 250,000 people. It just doesn't scale and work from a governance point of view. So you need some process around that. And it may represent lots of different groups of external users. You know, as I mentioned, projects are a typical example here. There might be a board portal, committee portals. It could be a customer portal, vendor portal, partner portal, what have you from that point of view. And there may be many different business owners. You know, it may have different owners for different portals within that structured extranet. And those owners may not just be internal to your organization, they may actually be external. Maybe you want to delegate to the external organizations that say, hey, we're going to build a customer portal, and each customer can designate, you know, 1, 2, or 3 sort of super users, and those users can invite and approve everybody else from that customer in there because they know best who should be coming into our customer portal. So you can dream up lots of different scenarios from that point of view. This is where we get into the deeper structured side. So typically, if we're talking about Microsoft 365, Azure Active Directory is underneath everything that Microsoft's doing in the cloud. You want to think about B2B, which is the business-to-business feature of Azure Active Directory. And what this does is it allows you to invite in guest users into your Azure Active Directory, and then you can apply permissions and give them access to whatever you choose within that. And it doesn't have to be restricted to Microsoft 365. You could have your own bespoke custom applications and provide access through that as well. It's completely free for external users. There's no cost to setting these guests up in your Azure Active Directory. In fact, there's no cost even to bring them into not all of Office 365, but certain features of Office 365. In particular, Teams and SharePoint Online, no cost to that. In fact, we're experiencing that today in this conference. You know, everybody's joining into a Teams tenant, and nobody's paying a Microsoft 365 subscription for their access in. They're all coming in as guests, myself included as a speaker in this session. Now, you'll sometimes hear about this 1-to-5 licensing ratio, that you can only bring in 5 external users for every 1 internal user that you have. It's actually a very small edge case, and what it is if there's Azure AD Basic or Premium features. Let's say you've got a highly secure structured extranet that's got confidential, really important information in there, and you want to make sure that not just your staff coming into there, but your external guest users coming in have to go through a multi-factor authentication. Maybe they have to use the Authenticator app or get an SMS text message, you know, and that there's conditional policies structured around that. Those features are part of Azure AD Premium, trying to set up those deeper conditional access security rules around coming in. If you have, let's say, 100 internal users that have Azure Active Directory Premium 2, and they have all those rich conditional access policies available to them, since you've got 100 of those licenses, you can bring 500 people in and apply those same rules to those external people with no additional cost for that. That's where the 1-to-5 ratio comes in, not for the broader, hey, I just want to bring these people into Teams or into SharePoint Online. You're fine. The guest licensing covers that from there. So basically, you can invite in as many external users as you'd like. Up on our website, we've got this article on B2B articles. It's basically a roll-up of dozens of different articles that Microsoft has published around B2B. It's one of our top pages on our site because it's a great reference just to find more detail around B2B. So I encourage you to check it out. Like I said, we're going to publish the deck. You'll be able to find that. You can actually search it up through our articles section on our site as well. Now, when you bring somebody in as a guest user through B2B, there's actually 3 different flavors of user experience that they're going to have as part of that. So if the person you've invited uses Office 365 themselves today, that's actually the ideal. They're going to come in. Odds are they're already going to be signed into their own Office 365 before they hit your portal. And as soon as they hit your portal, it'll flip through a login URL over to Microsoft. They won't really notice it because it won't prompt them with anything. It'll just redirect right past it and say, hey, you're already signed in. I'm going to do single sign-on into this portal that you're a guest in, and boom, you're in. It knows who you are, whatever permissions you have light up from there. So that's actually a really ideal user experience from there. Now, if they don't have an Azure AD account, there's abilities to turn on a preview feature called one-time passcode. Basically, what this does is, rather than forcing them to create an account and a password and a password recovery method and all that, which is confusing for people, it tends to discourage people from coming in because it's just too difficult to get through. What it does is it says, hey, press this button, we'll send you a code, check your email, paste the code in, and you're in. That becomes your password basically, and it's valid for 30 minutes. If you say, hey, remember me and keep me signed in, depending on your policies, you can leave that person signed in for up to 30 days. They need to come back in after that, just sends them a new code and they repeat the process from there. So it's actually really low friction, works really well from an onboarding point of view. The last scenario also in preview is actually federation with Google. So if you invite somebody in who's a Gmail user, they can actually have that same experience as a Microsoft 365 user, where they just bring their Google identity in, it knows who they are, and they're in as a guest from there. Now this center one, the one-time passcode, I mentioned it's in preview. It's actually going to become the only way for non-Azure AD, non-G Suite users to come in as of, I think, March of 2021. So they haven't taken it out of preview yet, but they're going to push it along pretty quickly and basically close the door on the unmanaged AD accounts that are still an option there today that we actually strongly discourage you from using. So if you're not using this in your tenant today, I would encourage you to turn the feature on. It's in the Azure portal, you set that up and start enjoying that from that point of view. So let's go through a bit of portals for external users, what this could look like. So again, there's a few different options here. So, you could roll your own portal. You could build, in .NET Core, in whatever development tool of choice you want to do through there. You can integrate it in Azure AD. There's no cost to doing that. There's lots of point of integrations to build through the Graph API. Absolutely, that's an option. Now, you can also use what's called Azure AD Entitlement Management. This is actually a feature that's part of Azure AD Premium 2. Basically, you create access packages. And those packages define groups that you need to belong to, applications you have access to, access into SharePoint Online. And when somebody requests that access package, there can be a workflow to approve that user in. Once they're approved and they go, then it grants them all those rights. And they're then able to access, for example, that SharePoint Online site or that application that you're providing through there. And there's some branding and customization you can do as part of that. The key is that 1-to-5 licensing ratio that I was talking about before comes into play here because you need one user licensed with Azure AD B2 for every 5 users you're going to bring in through this entitlement management. Shameless plug here, we also have a similar kind of functionality as part of our External User Manager product. Basically, you get a pre-built sample portal that you can brand and customize and basically use our admin portal to create and manage both users and groups from there. I'm going to pause for a second. There was a question from Christian. Does conditional access for guest users also apply to guest users created when sharing files externally and adding external users to an Office 365 group? Good question. So I'm actually not positive on the answer to that right now because it was in transition as of Ignite last fall, where what happened was the external sharing features and the one-time passcode stuff started in the SharePoint Online side, and then the Azure AD team said, hey, that's really cool, we should make it part of the core Azure AD, and they built their own part there, and now the SharePoint team is basically saying, well, let's discontinue what we've custom built and just leverage what's out of the box in Azure AD. I don't know if that sort of refactoring behind the scenes at Microsoft is completed at this point now or not, but basically once that's all done, then yes, all those Azure AD features, including conditional access, would be available even if you were just sharing directly through Teams or through SharePoint Online. I think we've got a couple of other questions here. Oh no, those were just questions making sure everything was working properly. Awesome. So actually, let me take you through some examples. I mean, we've got a couple that I provided links here for live sites. Ontario MD is a not-for-profit organization that helps manage physicians in the province of Ontario here. Ontario Association of Children's Aid Society, similar type of scenario. But this is actually the site that we're going to be using for our talk tomorrow. Now, we've actually been doing some late-breaking changes to it. We don't have it up on the production site yet, but let's take a second here and just go through that on the development site. Okay, so I'm over on our development site here. Let's just go back to the root of the site. So this site here is not SharePoint Online. This is just a .NET Core website, kind of hand-built with some content on there. We actually publish content from SharePoint Online into it. But the idea is, if I come down into the resources section, we're doing some cool things here. We're actually promoting videos that help from a therapeutic point of view from a pain management. So a buddy of mine, Rob Buren, had a spinal cord injury, basically paralyzed from mid-abdomen down. And he suffers a lot from phantom pain. So if we can help use VR to retrain the brain to convince it that his limbs are still working properly, it can actually really help from that phantom pain point of view. And one of the things we want to do is actually make those videos available in SharePoint Spaces. So SharePoint Spaces, if you're not familiar, is the virtual reality world that you can create inside of a SharePoint Online site. Now, to access that SharePoint Online site, you need an Azure AD account. So we're basically using the sign in register features on this site here to get us into that SharePoint Online site. So if I click on the register sign in, it'll take us to our own login process. It's actually not Azure AD at this point yet here. So if I just put in a dummy email address, and this is a common login, it checks to see if I already have an account or not. If I do, it takes me through the login process. If I don't, it takes me through the registration process. So it didn't see that email address before. It's saying, hey, you're a brand new user. Let's set up an account for you. So what's your main interest in coming to this site? Well, I'm actually quite interested in VR. So let's just choose that interested in VR option. Enter in some profile information. Say I want to receive the newsletter. Next on there, I get a little summary page saying, hey, here's what you just put in. You can come back and edit if you need to. And here's what to expect next. So this is where the Azure AD side comes in. So depending on which of those three options that I described, I'm going to see a slightly different experience through there. Now, this particular email address that I used is not an Office 365 user, and it's not a gmail.com email address. So I'm going to go through this one-time passcode. So if I say, yep, looks good, sign me up. What it's doing is it's using the Graph API to register that user as a guest user, put them in the appropriate group so they have access to the SharePoint Spaces VR space, and take them into the Microsoft login process. So we see we've left our site and we've gone to login.microsoftonline.com, and this is the one-time passcode experience. It's saying, hey, we're going to send a code to that email to sign you in. So I'll go ahead and send code. Let me bring up my email on the other side. And basically, this is the email that came through. Now, we haven't done any branding on this particular tenant. We could customize this a little bit. Basically, I want to take that verification code, paste it into my browser window here. And that was my sign-in process. Now, this is my first time coming in. So I have to consent to say, hey, there's certain things that this particular site as an external site would like to do with you. They want to sign you in and read your profile information. Yeah, that's okay. I accept that. Actually, I need to turn this off on our dev tenant. It actually wants us to set up multi-factor authentication. I generally wouldn't want this. So I'm just going to skip that for now. And now I'm back in that site that I was in to begin with. You can notice here I'm signed in as that new user. So I'm still not in SharePoint Online. I'm actually just in our bespoke website that we built, but we built it using Azure AD integrated sign-in through there, so that sign-in process comes through. Now from our dev site, the link over to SharePoint Spaces isn't going to work, but basically when I hit that link there, it wants to take me over into SharePoint.com and into that SharePoint space. And since I'm already signed in with my Azure AD credentials, it's going to take me in as a guest user, and away we go from there. So that's a nice example of the flow of how you can create a publishing site and share that out externally with people that you don't even know who that potential audience is from there. So going a little deeper from that point of view, we actually have another product called Extranet Publisher. What it does is it allows you to take content that you've authored in SharePoint and push that over onto an Azure website. So if we come back to our content here, being able to take this copy, these documents, videos, books, things that we've got up in here, and actually author that on Office 365, and then push those over onto a SharePoint site from there. I've also got a blog article up on my blog site, I believe. I have to double check that link. I should put it on this page here, that describes how to do this without our product. Just using a Logic Apps workflow to say, hey, when something happens in SharePoint, push that content over into an Azure website. So I don't need to buy a product to do this. You can actually do this yourself fairly easily as well. So a quick summary wrap up from here. So thinking about starting at the beginning from an out of the box unstructured point of view, whether you're in SharePoint, Teams, the OneDrive client, your local Windows Explorer, being able to use those same links across those to share and collaborate on documents. That's a great feature, and I strongly encourage it. There's a lot of use cases. We often get calls from people that are interested in our product and that say, hey, we've got a board of directors portal with 12 members that we'd like to share out with, and right away we say, you know what, we'll show you how to do that, but you don't actually need our product to do that. Using the out of the box actually works really well in those smaller use cases from there. But if you're going to be doing that, really think about your governance around how you're creating teams, how you're creating SharePoint sites, and making sure that only the right sites have the ability to do that external sharing, and that's set up appropriately through there. So you don't have to use our open source. There's some great commercial products out there. There's templating from Microsoft around that. Figure out your governance structure and make sure external sharing is part of that. Then we get into the full-on structured extranets, like the VRX therapy or the Ontario MD that I was showing you, that ability to publish content from SharePoint out into a public-facing website or a secure published website, and how that publishing process works. So I mentioned previously I'm going to be doing the modern sites provisioning and governance talk tomorrow and repeating on Wednesday. I'm actually repeating this talk on Wednesday as well. And then tomorrow, the VRX therapy that's leveraging virtual reality to reduce and eliminate pain. This one's actually a little unique because we're not actually going to be doing it as a live Teams meeting. We're going to be doing it as an AltSpace VR meeting. So if you've gone into the expo hall or you've poked around on that site at all, that's hosted in AltSpace. We actually have a separate theater space that we're doing the presentation in. So Rob and myself will actually appear up on a stage beside a big screen with our avatars. We can raise our hands because we're both going to be in Oculus Quests, and be able to interact with audience, take questions, raise hands, do things like that. So it's going to be a closer experience to a physical presentation where you're in person. It's actually going to be my first doing it from a VR Oculus Quest point of view. So there may be some rough edges on there, but I'm looking forward to it. It should be fun. If you're not sure how to get into that, I actually put a blog post up. I should put that link into the slide deck. If we come over to blog.petercarson.ca, it's actually my most recent post. It talks about how to get into AltSpace VR, how to do that with Oculus. It's maybe not completely prime time. There's a bunch of gotchas, a bunch of steps that you got to follow to get it going, but it is a really cool experience when you're there. And if you say, well, hey, I don't have a VR device like an Oculus, I can't do that. The answer is yes, you can. I mean, there is a Windows app for it. You can experience it in 2D, so you can absolutely experience the presentation just through your PC. You don't need to be in a VR device from that point of view. So I encourage you to check that out. So we're going to have a post-presentation breakout. So this is the URL here. Jordan, do we chat that out to the group? Is there an easy way for them to get that, or just off of the screen here?
Yeah, I've sent it out to the group already. And we do have another question. Is there a ratio requirement for external users to AAD user for Azure AD P1, or is P2 needed?
It's actually the same ratio for both P1 and P2. So if you only want to use P1 features, if you get conditional access policies as part of P1, and let's say that's all you want to do, then that 1:5 ratio can be used in that P1 scenario. If you want to go further and do something like entitlement management, which is a P2 feature, then you would need the appropriate number of P2 licenses. So it scales according to the features from there. There are some challenges around that. Like there's actually no licensing restrictions or controls around that. And I have no idea, let's say you had 100 staff, but you had 10,000 external users, and you knew that you only want to do conditional access policies on 500 of them. Well, the only way to remove the other 9,500 from that list is to make a conditional access policy to say don't apply policies to these other users. So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem from there. I don't think Microsoft's really figured that out, but it's more of an honor system. If you can prove to them that, look, we're only truly using the conditional access policies within the 1:5 ratio, I don't think an audit is going to bust you on that one.
Great, thank you so much, Peter. If anyone has other questions, as we mentioned before, you can join Peter in the post-session breakout area, which I've linked to in the Q&A here, We'd also love if you could provide us feedback. I've posted the feedback link as well. And thank you so much for watching. Thanks for your time today, Peter, and hope you have a great rest of your time at Commsverse.
Thanks, everybody.